Welcome back, listeners, to a new episode of The New Standard on September 3rd, 2022. And as always, I want to welcome my partner in crime, Neal Coulong. What's up, Neal?
Lance, the only thing I've been thinking the last couple of days, there's not any more Bison on the Steelers roster. I'm hurt. There was a time we had three of them. Three, if you count practice squad edition, Darius Shepard, wide receiver, Bison legends, Joe Haig, and Derek Tuska, both gone. Shepard, I think, was out last year, the year before, I forget. Sad. It's a sad day, Lance. Not going to lie.
I wish I had the ability to cue up music because I would play taps right now to commiserate the loss of.
Ed will play the green and gold, whatever it's called, the school song.
But I'm sure you guys will be in the national championship game as always. But with that, want to welcome everybody to the program. As always, please like and subscribe. So do us a favor, hit the like button and hit a subscribe. Also, please spread the word. Tune in, tell a friend, and subscribe. Also, if you want to join the experience via podcast, go to your podcast platform, do a search for The New Standard and Neal Coulong, or The New Standard and Lance Williams, or The New Standard and Steelers. Also, please support my boys' channel, Plant-Based Foods, Plant-Based Planet, where they do reviews of plant-based food. So big up to him. You know what I discovered this week, Neal, before we hop into the program? And the title of this week's program is In Mitch I Trust, I think.
Maybe.
You know what I discovered this week, Neal?
It's too late to go back.
An air fryer. Oh man!
Oh, dude, don't even get me started. Don't even get me started.
Okay. We will. We should have.
Okay. No, we've got the Yeti sponsorship that we need, and we need an air fryer sponsorship. Because seriously, I got an air fryer, and this isn't even a promo. I got an air fryer. I use that thing on average 1.5 times a day for the last 9 months at least. Absolutely love it. Still love it.
You know what the air fryer is like, listeners? The air fryer is like a new girlfriend. You're super excited about her. That's what the air fryer is. The air fryer is a new girlfriend when you first get it. You are super, super, super excited about it. And big up to Steelers Freak, who says he smokes plant-based products. But let's jump right into it. And the first topic I want to jump into is the thoughts on the 53-man roster and the practice squad, so on and so forth. And we'll take a look at it from the offensive perspective. We'll start at the quarterback position. And overall, I just want to get your thoughts, any surprises there at the quarterback position. And of course, this list is fluid. So I'm pulling up an old Steelers Wires article from a couple of days ago. So it could, so correct me if things have changed. So the quarterbacks, of course, Mitch Trubisky, Kenny Pickett, and Mason Rudolph. No surprises there, I'm thinking.
No, that's more or less what we thought it was going to be. The only mild, maybe kind of surprised we'll get into with the practice squad, but they kept 3 quarterbacks and no more.
Yeah, that has been what the Steelers have done. I trying to guess for the last 2 decades. I can't remember. I'm sure you can. Your memory's much better than me. I can't remember a time that they only kept 2. I know there was a time, I believe.
The rules changed at one point, too. There was a time in which you could have an emergency quarterback, Jarras, who didn't count on your 45-player game day roster. That changed when they added a 46-player to it. Some teams dressed 3 quarterbacks. That isn't very common. The Steelers have not done that. They tend to dress 2. A third one is there on the sidelines typically, but they don't obviously can't play that player. With that 3, they don't typically keep a 4th on the practice squad, but it depends. It's fluid. There are situations in which they have. I remember a time they had Duck Hodges, Mason Rudolph, and like JT Barrett and somebody else on the practice squad. It was any and all quarterbacks who were physically capable were on that Steelers team by the end of that season.
I'm chuckling, listeners, because that is absolutely the worst quarterback room possibly in NFL history. It might have been
the worst. It literally might have been the worst in the last 20 years. It was bad.
That's awful. And let's switch to the running back. It looks like they kept four. Correct me if I'm wrong again, Neil. Najee Harris, Jalen Warren, Benny Snell Jr., and Derek Watt. Okay, let me say this. Can we do a DNA test? Can somebody do a swab, get some saliva of Benny Snell Jr.? Benny Snell's real name is Benny Tomlin. His name has to be Benny Tomlin because I'm not sure the value that he brings from a special teams perspective is such that it warrants he always gets a spot on the 53. What's your thought on the running backs that they carry? And by the way, I'm not even certain what the role of Derek Watt is. So what's your thoughts on the running backs? I was kind of surprised they cut McFarland. I know that McFarland, correct me if I'm wrong, is on the practice squad, but what's your thoughts on the running backs?
You kind of stole my thunder. What I was going to say is that Benny Snell and Derek Watt kind of have the same general role on the team. They're not going to be utilized much on the offensive side, but they are key special teams players. Not to downplay that or suggest it isn't important. It's just fans will tend to look at Benny Snell as nothing but a running back. And we really don't get great insight into special teams, how it's conducted, what they're doing, and to a large degree, who's good at it and who isn't. Snell and Watt are good special teams players. I don't know what that's worth in a vacuum. To the Steelers, it's worth $3 million for Derek Watt. And somebody help me out. What's Snell at? 2 and change, I think.
Around there.
That goes along with the 3 that they're paying Miles Boykin, and we'll get to the receivers here in a little bit. It seems to me the Steelers really want to put together a dream team of non-return man special teams. They're spending a lot of money on special teams this year. And yes, there are some that play a functional role. But look at the 3 that I just mentioned. $3 million for Derek Watt. Call it 2 for Snell. 3 for Boykin. $8 million for 3 special teams players. I mean, you better cover every kick, and you better average, plus 15 for every punt return. If that's the unit you're going to roll out, that's the money you're going to pay for, because these guys are not going to be contributory pieces to your offense. We are 3 years past the point of talking about the fullback in this offense and the value that it has or does not have. Derek Watt is not going to pull down significant snaps. He's just not. To be honest, I think Connor Hayward in a similar role is probably more effective, and he has more roster utility than Watt does in terms of the offense. So I don't think it's a huge surprise. I think what it came down to is an undrafted rookie out of Oklahoma State named Jalen Warren looked better than both Anthony McFarland and Benny Snell. As a running back, I would have taken McFarland over Snell easily, very quickly. I don't think that's even close. I thought McFarland looked pretty good. I was excited to see if he would be able to carve out a role on this team. Didn't work out that way. All right. On the practice squad, I would even suggest Jalen Warren had a lot more value to another team in terms of going on waivers, getting picked up there, than McFarland. So if you're going to cut one of those 2, you'd cut McFarland and get him back on the practice squad. Players can be elevated up to 3 times, and you have up to 6 veterans with, plus 2 years of experience, I think, on your practice squad. So McFarland could be a player that they elevate the next 3 games for all we know. So they basically can carry 55 guys on their active roster for 3 games with those 2 players involved. I think McFarland's ability as a running back outweighs Snell's, but I think Snell is a valuable special teams player, and that's really what it came down to. But Warren is the guy to watch. I think what we saw of Jalen Warren speaks to the trend within the NFL. The running backs, in terms of their availability and their frequency, is such that the value of the position just goes down. I don't want to rehash the whole Najee Harris, whether he's worth a first-round pick or not, but Jalen Warren looks like a pretty damn good running back. This is a kid who didn't get drafted, okay? Did not get drafted, and he made the 53-man roster out of camp. They cut draft picks. A week before they got to the 53-man roster, they cut draft picks, and Warren made the team. Probably the second running back to be honest. So it goes to show how many good running backs there are available if you know kind of the basics of what you're looking for. Now, you don't need Jaylen Warren to run the ball 300 times. He can be effective in spots, and we'll see how that all shakes out. But I also think that running back was a position they would have liked to have kept 4 halfbacks, but with the moves that they had to make, it probably wasn't going to be worth it for them to be able to do that. They had to keep 7 wide receivers. We'll get to that in a second as well. They had moves to make on the offensive line. So I don't think they thought anybody was going to pick up Anthony McFarland. They got him on the practice squad, and that's probably the right role for him. Though I did like the way he looked in preseason.
Before we jump to the wide receiver position, I think I'm going to call Snell and Watt Benny Watt. Considering the similarity of the two in their roles, we're just going to call them Benny Watt. But when you look at the Steelers running back group, I mean, it's not the most talented group.
It doesn't need to be. They got their prize guy.
They got their guy.
Let's keep in mind these guys are running backs behind probably top 3 most utilized running backs in the NFL this season. They're not looking for these guys to come in and get carries. Okay,
right.
It's just not about that.
Right. Let's switch to the wide receiver position, and what I see here, we have Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool, George Pickens, Miles Boykin, Steven Sims, and our board Gunnar Olszewski. What's your thoughts on the wide receiver position? I think the wide receiver position is the most talented group on the offensive side of football. And I think it has the potential to be very good if they can get some consistent offensive line play, namely in pass protection. But I like the complement of wide receivers. I think Deontay Johnson, Claypool, and Pickens, they kind of mix and match. They kind of fit well together. What I'm looking for this year is who they're going to utilize a lot in the slot. I'm going to be interested to see that and how they incorporate Freiermuth with those 3, if he's going to be detached from the formation quite often this year. So I'm kind of excited about the wide receiver position. The one position group, I'm confident always that the Steelers can draft, coach, and develop is the wide receiver position. And I think when you've got Deontay, Chase Claypool, and George Pickens at the top of the room, I think that's just them continuing to do something that they do very well, and that's develop the wide receiver position. What's your thoughts on the wide receivers?
In typical Steelers fashion, it's going to be one of their best and deepest units. You've got a lot of strength at the top. I think their 3 deep is very, very talented. From there, it was a very interesting mix of players who all competed very well. As I have said in this program a couple times, it seemed to me from early on into camp, Calvin Austin is destined for IR. He's a 4th round pick. He didn't get any time in camp. They're not going to need him, but they're not going to subject him to waivers either. So they kept him to put him on IR, which puts him out for at least 4 games. Who knows the exact extent of his injuries to suggest how long he's going to be out, but he needs to get on the field in order to kind of learn and figure things out. But they kicked that decision down the road a month. We'll find out later on what exactly will happen with Calvin Austin.
Let me pause you real quick, Neal. Let me pause you real quick before you continue to break down your thoughts on the wide receivers. Briefly, break down how the IR works and when Austin can return.
Okay, so a couple different forms of injured reserve or IR that you need to take note of. Starting at the beginning of it, there's something called the physically unable to perform, the PUP or the PUP list, which is for players that never practice. In other words, they do not set foot on the field. What teams do is they have their conditioning test the day before camp officially starts. Players run and do all of that. And basically what they say is if you can't finish the test or you can't do the test, you're going to go on the PUP list to start. You cannot, once you have set foot on a practice field, you can't go on the PUP list. So a player that they're not sure of immediately, health-wise, will go on the PUP list. From there, you can be added to the PUP list at the end of preseason and training camp. So once you're on it, you can stay on it or you can come off and practice as normal. But you can't go to PUP after you've started practice. injured reserve or IR has two components to it. First off, you have practiced, so you're not eligible for the PUP list. Then if you are put on injured reserve during preseason training camp, the non-regular season, or I should say before cuts are made, if you are put on injured reserve, what that really means is you're waived. In other words, they're cutting you due to injury. If you clear waivers, you can go to the team's injured reserve list, which puts you out for the entire season. If that happens before the final cuts, it's a very important distinction. I'm trying to be brief as I can here, Lance. I know that you're getting edgy over there, but once in the preseason, if you go on IR, you're done for the year. This is important to the Steelers because you might remember Lance brought up the slot receiver position. That was a position the Steelers really wanted Anthony Miller to maintain this year. He got hurt. They put him on injured reserve. Okay, so that knocks him out for the entire season. He's done. But the team controls his contract for the next year. It tolls, it doesn't count. He gets paid, but the contract does not extend a year into the next year of his deal. So they still have Anthony Miller next season. Also, what can happen with that is they waive with injury the player. He's not claimed on waivers. They can release them off of injured reserve. They come to an agreement on a buyout. So let's say that it was Anthony Miller. That was not the case here, but typically Anthony Miller is deemed to be injured. They're not going to try to get him on the 53-man roster. They'll release him with, like, I don't know, call it 4 games worth of pay. I don't know exactly what the amount is. It would depend situation to situation. And he's done. He's a free agent. He's able to sign wherever he wants if anybody wants to sign him. It's just they have a diagnosed injury of the player. We don't get the details on that, but it's important to note when the Steelers, if they don't put the guy on injured reserve, which is far more common than them putting him on injured reserve during training camp. From there, when you have the final cuts, so you cut down to the 53-man roster of the team, those players who are there can be put on injured reserve, but they are eligible to come back after a certain amount of time. The minimum now is 4 weeks. So if Calvin Austin, who was put on injured reserve, DeMonte Casey, who was put on injured reserve, the Steelers kept them through the cuts. So they didn't put him on injured reserve when they got hurt. We knew Casey was out for a long time. That was obvious when we saw it happen. Poor kid. It was terrible. Carl Joseph, he was put on injured reserve during training camp. So he's out for the year automatically. They kept Casey onto the 53-man roster because he has a chance to return this season, and they want him to. So Casey and Austin were kept onto the roster. And the Steelers kept 7 receivers, which is the most they've ever kept, onto that, knowing that they're going to put Austin onto injured reserve. So now they have 6. They also kept Steven Sims, who really is kind of the last one that they kept. Boykin and Olszewski both made the team. I don't think that we necessarily expected both players to make it. Tyler Vaughns was the guy that I don't think anybody expected to not be on the Steelers in some way. Didn't work out there for them, but the 2 players they put on injured reserve, DeMonte Casey and Calvin Austin, are both eligible to come back after 4 weeks into the season. Doesn't mean they will. It's just that's the first time that they can. So it's important to know that because in KZ's case, that's why they cut, I always call him Marcus Allen, a veteran player that the Steelers know, and he probably doesn't have a whole lot of utility outside of the Steelers simply because he's been with them the whole time and he's not an outstanding player. They cut him and said, basically, look, we're cutting you so we can keep KZ on the roster. After cuts, we'll put him on an injured reserve, and then we're going to re-sign you. So don't sign anywhere else. He didn't have to do that. It was just kind of an agreement that they made. And what you'll hear around the league is they call that an administrative move, meaning they're just doing it to comply with the rules. This is really how it's going to work. But he does have the ability to sign anywhere else. Allen did after he got cut. The fact that he got cut, though, really kind of speaks more to The idea that they're going to bring him back. This is just something they need to do. They'll give him the same contract. He doesn't lose anything. So it's not a huge deal. It's important to know that's why they cut certain players. And I'm always thinking about air fryers. I don't know about you, Lance.
Steelers freak is absolutely the funniest dude ever. Let's jump to the tight end position, and the room is Fryermuth, Gentry, and Hayward. I surprisingly like this room. I like all three players. I think Connor Hayward is going to be a good player. I think because of his versatility, we're going to see some 12 personnel this year. That's one running back, two tight ends. I think we're going to see some 12 this year. I really like Connor Hayward, and I don't think it. I think he's a solid football player. I don't think he's on the roster, to placate his brother. I think he can add some really good things to the Steelers offensively over the course of time as they continue to run this offense under Matt Canada. What's your thoughts, really briefly, on the tight end room?
I'll say this: from where they were 2 years ago, it's a dramatic improvement. I mean, they've solved a lot of the issues they had there. I think Fryermuth's going to have a good season. I really like Gentry. What he's compliments to the Steelers for developing him. He looked like a complete waste, in my opinion, when they drafted him. He's turned into a fairly solid second tight end, a guy that I think they probably will want to extend. His contract is up this coming off season. I think they'll want to keep him. He does really well. And Connor Hayward, I didn't think that they were going to use as a pure tight end, but they even gave him Heath Miller's number, and clearly that's how he's been utilized, and he's looked pretty good. There's some schematic, and I don't want to say concerns, but he's not very big compared to tight ends. Like, you're not going to ask him to inline block an NFL defensive end very often. He's going to be more of a switchblade type of guy. You can move him around and use him schematically probably a little bit better than what you can do with Zach Gentry. But keep in mind, this was an offense that gave Zach Gentry he had 5-6 screen passes last year, much to the ire of many fans. And I think Hayward can play in that kind of a role. He can get himself open in the flats. He's fairly reasonable in the middle of the field. So it'll be interesting to see how often they utilize him in what they're going to do. But he's the type of guy that it will have stuff drawn up specifically for him and his very unique skill set for the position that he plays.
Let's switch to the offensive line. And when I list the offensive line, listeners, I'm going to give the PFF pass blocking grade for these guys and where it ranks.
Preseason or last season?
I think the way they did it, I think, I think the way they did it, well, I don't have it for some of the backups, but I think the way they did it on PFF, it was based on the preseason. Okay. So, of course, you have Kendrick Green, J.C. Hassenauer, Dan Moore Jr. Dan Moore Jr.'s pass blocking grade was 59.5, which ranked 82nd among tackles. Mason Cole, his pass blocking grade was 44.1, which ranked 46th. Chooks Okorafor, and Chooks was 77th, ranked 61.1. James Daniels was ranked 31st amongst guards. Jesse Davis, ironically, the guy that they just recently picked up, he was ranked 90th in pass blocking with the 51 grade.
That's a big number.
Yes, I mean that, and it's, I think it's only like maybe 100, maybe 100 tackles. So he was ranked like almost dead last in terms of pass protection. And last but not least, we have Trent Scott. This is what I want to say with the offensive line, is that when you're going to get Jesse Davis, it kind of just says where your offensive line is. This offensive line, needless to say, is a work in progress. And as much as we like to knock Mitch Trubisky, this offensive line is really going to be, as it gels, is going to be the most critical factor in terms of what this team does offensively. What's your thought about this offensive line group and the guys that they kept and the composition of it?
It's what we thought it would be. The Jesse Davis move in reality is trading nothing for what they feel is an upgrade over Joe Haeg. Bison legend Joe Haeg needed to go for Jesse Davis, who I had many people who know the position very well describe Jesse Davis as, to put it mildly, less than adequate. He got what is in the market a very cheap deal for a starting tackle in the NFL with the Vikings in March, and he didn't make the team. They wouldn't have traded him if he was going to make the team. They were going to cut him. So the fact that he's a reject kind of suggests he's the perfect fit for the Steelers offensive line and what they're doing right now. I don't think it matters. I'm tongue in cheek in regards to Bison legend Joe Haeg. Joe Haeg is not a spectacular NFL tackle. I don't think anybody would argue that he is. They felt that Davis was an upgrade over Haeg. I don't think they brought Davis in expecting him to start at any position. I know he's played pretty much all of them and has been good at none of them, which fits a lot of the Steelers offensive linemen. But he's not going to be a consistent presence on offense. He's probably a special teams guy more than anything. And they didn't really give up anything for him. They just took on a little bit of salary. And I don't even know how it shook out between him and Haeg, but that's really what it was. It has nothing to do with Chooks. It has nothing to do with Dan Moore. It has nothing to do with James Daniels, Kevin Dotson, or Kendrick Green. He's Joe Haeg's replacement. So take that for what that's worth, which it isn't much. And their offensive line is the group we thought that it would be. I don't no surprises on a group that isn't very good anyway. Trent Scott was added after the fact. He was the other guy when I mentioned about the IR moves that they had made. It was Trent Scott and Marcus Allen who came back. And I don't know how good Trent Scott really is or if he really matters significantly. The question of this team early in the season and probably most of the season is going to be the offensive line. And that didn't really change from a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago.
I impressed myself because I'm usually I get cliches and sayings and phrases incorrect, but the offensive line is the land of misfit toys. That offensive line, it's just SMH.
It might be the worst in the league. It might be the worst in the league. I don't know if we've ever said that.
That especially for a Steelers group. Before we jump back, before we jump to the defensive side of football and break down the 53, I want you to jump into Neal Stradamus. In a perfect world, offensive line plays to its ceiling. The offense plays to its ceiling. Of course, I'm asking this question, in terms of injuries, everybody stays healthy. What's the ceiling in terms of points per game for this offense?
Everything clicks.
Yes.
25 and a half, I'd say. My only thought for increasing it over, I think the league average is probably 23 and a half to 24, somewhere in there. The only reason I would give them a bump ahead of that is because I think they have some some playmakers at the receiver position. And I think Mitch Trubisky knows that he's playing in a contract year. And he's also going to be backed up by some combination of two quarterbacks who will throw the ball deep because they're playing for their future starting job, which is Pickett next year, or some placement in the NFL, which is Rudolph. They're going to have to throw the ball if they get on the field. And I think Trubisky knows that. I think he's going to have to cut it loose a little bit. They might hit on a few things because of that. That's incredibly optimistic. 25 and a half overall. I don't think they can score more than 27 in a game. I hope I'm wrong, but I just don't see them being effective enough overall as an offense. And they're going to have to get hot and do a great job. We saw them play well as an offensive unit, particularly the offensive line, a couple games last season. I'm not putting that past them, but a lot of the consternation against this year's offensive line is caused by last year's team and the presence of a lot of the players that were there last year. Let's remember that. This unit is not really exceptionally better or worse than it was last year. And it wasn't good last year, but it wasn't a complete dumpster fire either. It was bad at times. They showed up a couple times. I thought they did. They availed themselves well down the stretch. And it probably wasn't coincidental when Adrian Clem wasn't there anymore. They put together a couple good games, the last 2-3 that they played. So it's not completely hopeless. It's just not going to be good. You think of it like that. There's a big difference between average and terrible in the NFL. I don't think they're an average unit. They can be better than terrible. They'll be in that range somewhere. And with it, they'll get a couple games that they score 26, 27, 28, somewhere in there to bump up their overall average. But it's not going to be good. They're not going to be a good offensive team.
I put in the chat 24. I just can't. 25 seems high. 24 actually seems high to me. I probably want to say 23.
It's really hard. Not a whole lot of teams are really averaging truly below 24.
I want to say league average is the ceiling.
Take out, you're the math guy. I don't know what this terminology is. Take out the top 3 and the bottom 3. Average out that. That's probably around 24 and a half. All that.
Yeah. You're probably right.
The bottom 3, it's not even fair. You can't compare the Jaguars to the rest of the NFL last season. Not with what they had in the first 10 games. Yeah. It's a mess. You had teams that were playing on their fourth quarterbacks. You have to throw out the bottom 3 to average anything in the NFL, because the bottom 3 are going to be so far below the mean that it throws everything else off. That's just my opinion. We can, I don't know, maybe we'll hash out the numbers here at some point.
Steeler Freak is my guy. Thanks, Neal. I'm having Maylocks for breakfast. You might need to. That offensive line.
If you expected this offense to be good this year, you need to be eating a lot more than Maylocks. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry. There's no way it's going to be good. Their protection's too bad. Their quarterback is too limited. They have good receivers. They have a running back who has a Lisfranc sprain. That's not something that just goes away, by the way. And he's their only running back, as we established earlier. They're just not going to be good enough. There's no scheming that can get around those deficiencies.
Let's jump to the defensive side of football, where hopefully let there be some light. Let's jump to the defensive line. You got Cam Hayward, Larry Ogunjobi, Montravius Adams, Isaiah Loudermilk, Tyson Alualu, Chris Wormley, and DeMarvin Leal. I like this group. I think this group is versatile and deep. And I think if you get an injury, they might be able to survive it a little bit better than they did last year when Tyson Alualu gets hurt. But I think the key player on this line, of course, we know Cam Hayward. But Tyson Alualu, you got an older player that needs to hold up in terms of run defense. I mean, basically, if Tyson Alualu is on the field, teams don't run well against the Steelers. If Tyson Alualu is not on the field, we saw what happened last year. They become one of the worst defensive run-stopping units in the National Football League.
Not entirely fair. Not entirely fair. But Alualu went down 2 games in last year. They played for a while without Alualu. People forget this. I'm sorry that if I were to come up with a rant, it would be on the incredible value Tyson Alualu gets on this defense, despite the fact that he has not played much in the last 2 years. It's certainly not healthy. He even said he was hurt for most of 2020. He went down by the end. He wasn't playing as well midway through the season, through the rest of the season, as he was in the first 6 games. That's really all they've gotten out of him recently. I pissed off a lot of people, I guess, when I dared to suggest if the Steelers don't keep 7 defensive linemen, which is not normal for them, by the way. They kept 7. They don't usually do that. If they were going to keep 6, I felt Alualu is as possible as a cut as anybody else was on the defensive line, because he's 35 years old. He hasn't played football in almost a year and on game days, and he makes $3 million. You don't have to look very far in the NFL to see that that's a combination of issues for a guy that gets cut. it does not suggest that he isn't a good player. I know that he is, but I hate to use this. We use this phrase for players that we don't like, but we'll never touch it for the ones that we do. But you can't make the club from the tub. All right. It's
I
not to
love that. I
suggest,
love that phrase.
and it's not to suggest that he wasn't healthy to whatever degree he needed to be in camp. I just mean injuries take their toll. He broke his ankle. That's true. That doesn't change the fact that at 35 years of age, at 25, this is true, but at 35 years of age, you do not get better at football by not playing football. It's just that's life. That's nature. Don't blame me. I didn't make the rules. People don't like that being said about Tyson Alualu. They will say it about any player they don't like. All of it is true for both examples. Okay. You can't expect him to make it 17 games. So in a way, they have to keep 7 guys. Montravius Adams was signed as insurance to this, in my opinion. If they wanted to keep Alualu, they needed to back him up. And Adams might not play much at all, which I think is kind of odd because I think he's a good player. But I have plenty of people in the know that are telling me he's not as good as I think he is. All right, I'll accept that. But Alualu goes down in week 3. You're going to see what happened last year happen again. That's why Adams is there. That's why you had to keep 7 guys.
Do you think they try to mitigate that before we jump into the next unit, the linebackers? And by the way, the grade for Trent Scott, according to PFF, overall was 39.6, which is terrible.
He sucked, but he's average. He's a backup on that team.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Pass blocking.
Starters were at the same level.
His pass blocking grade is 28.6, and his run blocking grade is 51.1. So he fits in nicely into the room of the land of misfit offensive line toys.
He's not going to show up anybody, that's for sure.
How do they mitigate that? Do you think they rotate Alualu to try to keep his snaps down early in the season to try to get him through the season or get him to play as much football as he possibly can? Is Adams that guy?
With like everything, it's situational. It depends. I think the Ogunjobi signing changes things up a little bit for maybe what they were planning on doing. That is another argument that was made against what I was saying was Ogunjobi is really the 7th guy, so to speak. They would have kept 6. Adams might have been the odd one out, but they signed Ogunjobi, who might be able to fill in a couple different spots and be a pretty consistent 30-plus snap guy for him. I don't know if that's their plan necessarily, but as I've said all off season, Lance, this defense built itself to be versatile. They're deep on defensive line. When I say deep, I mean they kept a lot of guys. They kept a lot of corners and safeties. There are a lot of package concepts that they're going to run that might not be considered your bread and butter. Okay, let me just throw this quick offshoot to everything. When somebody starts discussing with you the base defense of the team and acts like this is a 3-4 defense, they don't know what they're talking about. Barely anybody in the NFL has something they run very often that does not include at least 5 defensive backs anymore. So you can't run a pure base 3-4 defense with 5 defensive backs on the field. So the Steelers have loaded up on defensive linemen. They kept 7 and didn't move anybody to IR, which I thought they were going to do. And they have 10 defensive backs as well. They're going to rotate guys in, and they're going to go heavy in their secondary. It's their linebackers that are going to see kind of the hit of that. I think that the cuts that they made speak to that a little bit. More defensive backs with safeties in particular, and more defensive linemen rotating in to anywhere from 2 to 4 man fronts. That's really what we're going to see out of their defense this year.
Since you're talking about it, Neal, let's pivot really quickly to the linebacker position. They kept Devin Bush, Miles Jack, of course, TJ Watt, Highsmith, Robert Spillane. And on this list, it still has Derek Tuska, but Derek Tuska is no longer on the roster. Mark Robinson,
terrible.
Malik Reed, and Marcus Allen. What's your thoughts on the linebacker position?
Linebacker? Funny.
And continue your thoughts on the versatility and what we're going to see schematically in terms of how these linebackers are used. I like where you were going with your point in terms of what they're going to try to do defensively.
I think you have a lot of options. You have inside, outside, 5 technique and in kinds of linemen. That's your Cam Haywards, that's your Ogunjobis, your Chris Wormleys, your Montravius Adams and Alualu. These guys can play 1, 3, and 5 in your defense. They're going to line them up at multiple positions and use them. I don't want to say creatively, because it's not like they're reinventing defense. It's just they're going to put different guys in different spots, so it's harder to kind of get a feel of what they're doing. That's important. It should keep them fresh, because as we've talked about on this show, Lance, I don't know how many times, Cam Hayward was playing at a defensive player of the year level up until that Vikings game, that short week road game against an unfamiliar team, which I'm the biggest Cam Hayward fan you're ever going to meet. He was bad in that first half. He was just, and you could tell he was just dead. He was tired, and there was nobody backing him up. Nobody else was playing around him. Thanks, linebackers. But a big part of all this was they didn't get a chance to spell him at all because they needed him so badly. You want Cam Hayward on the field. You're not a better team without Cam Hayward on the field, but you do have to prepare for a marathon as opposed to a sprint every single week. There are times that he's going to have to play more. There are times you're going to need to find ways to get him off the field a little bit here and there. And I'll bet, off the record, he's going to tell you the same thing. They're not defensive linemen at 33 years of age are not going to be as effective playing 95% of your snaps. I know that he wasn't at 95, but it was not far from that. He was asked to do a ton as well. So the depth that's there, it isn't just for Cam, it's for everybody. Alualu broke his ankle. That can happen on his first snap of the season. There's no way to really prepare for that fully, but he's still an older player. He also has not played for a long time. He wasn't going to go all out in training camp anyway. You don't know what you're going to get from him yet. My opinion, don't keep guys on the bench that aren't going to play. I think that's why Carlos Davis is not on the team. He's on the practice squad. You have a guy there that can be, he can still continue to be in meetings, learn what's going on, but you don't count on him to have a helmet. You need guys that are going to play on your defensive line. I think all 7 of those guys are going to play.
Looking at the linebacker room, I mean, what's your overall thoughts? I mean, we've talked ad nauseum about Devin Bush and his struggles. We've talked about Robert Spillane and some of the vulnerabilities that you have if Robert Spillane is playing a lot of snaps. I like the fact that they went out and got Reed to address the lack of depth from the outside linebacker position. In terms of sub-package football, nickel and dime, who plays more snaps, Spillane or Bush? Because I can see a world where they play a ton of dime and Bush and Spillane are off the field. And they're going to play a lot of dime with Miles Jack. And if KZ comes back or if they find another guy, we'll talk a little bit more about that, to replace KZ while he's on IR or while he's hurt. I think you could see Edmonds in the box with Jack as well, to play a little bit lighter and have another defensive lineman up front, where you have 3 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and you have another 5 DBs. I mean, what's your thought? I mean, what's your thought in terms of this linebacker group and how it's going to shake out in terms of sub-package football?
I think if I knew, the Steelers would have done a terrible job in preparing to play what they've signed. We shouldn't know, because frankly, you say sub package, I'm talking defensive football. There's no sub packages anymore. The sub packages are normal. If you want to categorize it simply as a nickel, you're missing a ton. I think they're going to play 5 and 6 defensive backs on pretty much all of their non-short yardage / goal line snaps. I think that's just the way they play football now. They have a stand-up defensive end. That's essentially what TJ Watt is. He has coverage responsibilities. I'm not trying to act like he's not doing what he's credited with doing. They use him on the line. That's not the way outside linebackers in a pure 3-4 have ever been used. They're off a little bit. He is playing essentially a stand-up 7 technique defensive end. Highsmith does the same thing. In fact, Highsmith's got his hand on the ground a lot of the times. The strong side outside linebacker, if they switch and want to play it like that, he has the ability to do that. He's done that. He's got the size to do that. How you want to coordinate that is up to the experience and the versatility that you have among your players, and they kept all of their players. They're not letting guys that played that they wanted to have play a significant amount of snaps in their front seven walk away. If you want to count Joe Schobert to that, I don't think you want Miles Jack as a lone linebacker in a 7 defensive back package. I don't think he has the athleticism for that anymore, and you can't really count on it as well. Solid player. I'm not sure he's going to be a pure third down kind of linebacker. They're begging Devin Bush to be able to play like that. I'm not sure if he will. But at the same time, between the three of them, all of them are going to get snaps. They're all going to play in those situations, just simply because I think their best value is going to be versatility, changing things up. And that's why they signed the amount of guys that they have. They kept Robinson and Spillane. Keep that in mind. Those are their I don't want to call either of them necessarily most versatile, but they're probably more special teams guys than anything else. But they can be utilized in certain roles. They're specialty kinds of players. That's who they have backing up the outside linebackers now. Malik, I forgot his last name. Hill, the kid that just got Reed. Sorry, why I can't do that. Malik Reed from Denver is a solid NFL player. He's the guy they wanted Melvin Ingram to be. And I think that's what they're going to get from a player that actually cares about a team, isn't a mercenary the way that Ingram was. They'll get good run out of him. That also helps you keep it's some combination of Watt and Highsmith on the bench for a snap or two. It's not going to kill them to do that. You don't want TJ Watt off the field. I get it. But sometimes he gets banged up a little bit. He doesn't have to go back out there and be a liability. It happens. That's football. They're not indestructible every single play. Having some depth there to spell a player in certain situations, plus the real value is you get Reed onto the field fresh. He only has a couple opportunities to step in and make a play. He's fired up and ready to go. And he's a good player. He's going to want to make his mark. So there are benefits to that. The inside linebackers, I think, are going to once again be the weakness of the team defensively overall. But you get some good play out of Jack. You hope Devin Bush does something to merit his inclusion in the team on the roster. Spillane is experienced. He's a run defender. We'll see what Mark Robinson can be. I really like what they have with him. I was glad they kept him on the roster as well. We'll see about the linebackers. It's really going to be a hodgepodge of everything. And I think that's going to be the strength of the defense. I think they're going to do a lot of different things overall this season. And Richard, you fall apart in the playoffs. All right. I don't want to hear it about Cam. Don't tell me that.
Hey man, don't ever say anything bad about Cam or Bison football, or you will get banned for life. On
2 no-nos with me. I don't want to hear it.
2 no-nos. Let's jump into the last unit. We're going to combine the two cornerbacks and safeties, Witherspoon, and we're going to start with the cornerbacks: Witherspoon, Sutton, Wallace, Millette, James Pierre. At the safety position, Minkus Fitzpatrick, Terrell Edmonds, Miles Killebrew, Trey Norwood, and of course, KZ is not being listed because of IR and his injury. I really like this group. It's kind of grown on me. Initially, when I looked at the cornerback position and the safety position in the secondary, there wasn't a number one, and I'm just using number one loosely, like a dominant corner, a number one corner, a big name guy. But I think you can get – I think the issue in the NFL at the cornerback position is I think you can survive with average. You can't survive with bad. And you can't – you would better have – it's better, I think, to have a collection of average to good than top-heavy good, and then a lot of the other guys are bad.
It's
like
depth.
That kind of mix – like the depth at the position kind of helps when you have a lot of players around a B minus, B plus, around there, and you can fit those pieces together and they do different things that complement each other. I think it could be the sum of the parts. It becomes a nice DB room, like Mel said, because you have versatile players that can do different things and do them fairly well. And then you can implement them and weaponize them in a variety of ways. And the thing I saw in preseason was and I think this is why the KZ injury is really significant, is they were really trying to weaponize Minkah Fitzpatrick. I saw them doing different things with Minkah. I had never seen them really blitz Minkah as much as they did in the preseason. And I like the fact that they implemented, a three safety look where they had KZ on the field with Edmonds and Fitzpatrick. So it's going to be interesting to see who they have do that position that KZ was playing in those defenses. But I kind of like this room. I like this. I like this cornerback room. And surprisingly, I think the defensive line is the strength of this defense. But I like the secondary. I like the way it's trending. I thought they played really quality football in the preseason.
I don't think it's a coincidence that your defensive line is built very similarly to your secondary and vice versa. I think they went for depth, not high-priced players like they have. I mean, to be fair, you have an opportunity to get Steven Nelson at that point for $8 million a season. You take it. Joe Hayden, same thing, $9 million. You get advantage. You take advantage of that when you can. It's not just about one guy in the secondary, especially if your plan is kind of subterfuge. I think they're going to throw a lot of different things at a lot of different people. They drafted Trey Norwood. I don't know if another team would have drafted Trey Norwood. And it's not because Trey Norwood is a terrible player. It's because he is he's an outstanding specialty guy. He can kind of do one thing really well. He's not going to be a box safety. He's not going to be a deep center fielder, but he is adept in coverage in the slot. Not quite big enough yet, I don't think, to be a real a consistent nickel guy. But that's what the nickel position is in the NFL nowadays. It's really a pure coverage linebacker or linebacker who excels in coverage. It's kind of a combination of those things. Norwood isn't quite big enough yet, but if you go six deep and you've got him on a receiver on the inside, you're okay with that. That's a nice matchup. That's a nice guy to have as a seventh round pick. Is he going to make $100 million a year? No, probably not. He was never going to be a first round draft pick. He can play better in the right kind of structure. That's why they took him. I feel like Wallace as well as Witherspoon are similar to that. They're outside guys. You're going against the big money receivers, but they can play within a zone defense, match zone at the very least. They can cover guys down the field, but you can move them around as well. They have versatility. And when you have a lot of safeties, which is really what they want to do, considering the amount of money that they put into the safety position, and they still wanted DeMonte Casey to play a bunch of snaps for them. If it wasn't him, it was going to be Carl Joseph, cheaper guys that play specific positions on the field. They're not just backups anymore. They have specific roles to play depending on who they're going against, and depending on the personnel from other teams. They're going to be utilized in the ways that they play the best. They're not great over 65 plays, but for 10 snaps in the situations that they're specifically prepared for, they're going to be good players. I think it's the same as the defensive line as well. And we're going to see a lot of guys in the snap count columns on Mondays following games among the Steelers defensive linemen and defensive backs this year.
And I think we're going to see that first week, and we'll talk about that more next week. And we're going to change the schedule a little bit for the start of the season. Not sure what time, but we are going to do, similarly to last year, we're going to do a pregame on Wednesday. And of course, we're going to do a postgame. So hopefully we have a special guest next week to help us break down week one against the Bengals. And I think you're going to see that in the first game of the season. I think you're going to see the versatility of this secondary against a very, very good wide receiver group with the Cincinnati Bengals. I want to ask you the same question that I did in terms of the offense. What's the ceiling for this defense? And I want you to frame it in terms of points per game. And if you don't want to do that, just in terms of dominant, is it going to be a top 10 unit, top 5? Just in terms of ceiling for this defense, what do you see?
I think they could be a top 10 scoring defense. Like every defense in the NFL for the most part. I think they're going to get touched up a few times here and there. I could see them giving up 20 points a game, though. That's going to be a pretty competitive mark against the rest of the league. They should be top 5 in sacks, assuming, injury luck is as much a part of that as anything else, especially when you have a guy like TJ Watt. I wouldn't bet high on TJ Watt playing 17 games. I wouldn't bet high on him playing 15 games, to be honest with you. It seems like an injury is overdue for that explosive of a player at that physically tolling of a position with his advancing age and snap count in his career. I think there's an injury coming. I hope that's not the case. They can still generate pressure. They will continue to generate pressure. And I think that will be kind of a trademark again of what they do. Takeaways, I don't know. It's so hard to tell. They're not specifically built for that. They don't have a guy that really does that well. And a lot of times, too, the best takeaway teams have linebackers that take the ball away in coverage. I'm not sure the Steelers will have that this year. So top half, they won't be like devoid of takeaways, but top 10 scoring defense, top 5 sacks, probably top half in takeaways.
If they are a top, if they give up 20 points per game, that would put them at roughly 5th in the National Football League compared to last year. New Orleans was 19.7. They were 4th. San Francisco was 5th at 20.6. Now, we gave out your numbers. You gave out your numbers. And I think the defense can be that. I think it depends largely upon injury, and you don't have a significant fall off from the superstars on this defense. I mean, hell, if Minkah Fitzpatrick tackles better, they'll be a much better defense. I thought he struggled largely last year from a tackling perspective. But I think if TJ Watt and Cam Haywood play to their level, I could see where this is a defense that is probably around that mark. I mean, last year they gave up 24.4, so that would be a 4-point improvement. Let's say they get the 4-point improvement. They give up 20 and they give up 25 a game. What's the ceiling in terms of wins for this team? I think we have them. I think you have them at 7-10, I believe.
Yep.
Let's say if they play to their ceiling on both sides of the ball. What's the expectation for the Steelers this year? What's the best expectation you think is realistic for fans to have of this football team?
Best realistic in my mind is 9-8. And that's best. That's everything goes well and they play above what I'm expecting them to play offensively. I think 9-8 is reasonable. And the defense will still be the stronger of the two sides of the ball. I don't think that'll be a question. That's also a season in which Chris Boswell is the all-pro kicker. That needs to happen. It could easily fall to 6 wins if Boswell can't kick because they're going to need him probably more than anybody. I just don't think where they are right now, they're still rebuilding. And I don't think offensively they're going to be very good. Everything can go right on their offensive line, and they just simply aren't talented enough to win those 5 extra plays that determine close games. I could see it being the kind of season where they lose close more often than not. I could see them taking a big step back in that way, unlike last year, where they won a lot more than they should have. 9-8, I think, would be where I sit today, and mark this down if you want. 9-8 would be a damn miracle. Almost as miraculous as 9-7-1 was last year.
I'm going to disagree slightly just by a game, though. I'm going to go 10-7. I think if everything works to their ceiling, to their optimum 10-7, I'm going 10-7 because I'm going to throw a turnover in there here or there, which flips a game that they should have lost and they win surprisingly. Or there's a surprise win in there that they get that nobody expects, maybe against like Tampa Bay. Maybe they beat Tampa Bay and there's a surprise game because, Tom Brady gets upset at Giselle before the game and throws 3 picks and somehow is mad that she wants to go on a vacation during the bye week. But, so I think, I think 10-7 is the high water mark. And I think the high water mark, if everything goes well, 10-7, it's a playoff appearance. You lose first weekend in the playoffs. I can't see them. I think there's an improvement at the quarterback position. Obviously, we're running a little bit long on the show. I wanted to talk about the differences in a Trubisky offense.
We need to talk about Double H hitting on Giselle.
but let me say this though. So
Sorry.
Vegas has the over 7.5 wins at a plus 105. I think that's what it is.
Sounds right.
You're laying 100. Are you taking that bet?
I'd bet under 7.5. where I sit right now, I think they're a 7-10 team. I think they were a 7-10 team last year and might have been worse if not for a lot of luck. You don't get that lucky 2 seasons in a row. I don't think their offensive line, from what I've seen to this point, has improved enough for me to really change that. And defensively, all of this can fall apart with a key injury to a couple players that, well, one of them had to be, in my opinion, they had 2 defensive player of the year candidates through 8 games last year. And one of them won it, and the other one, it wore out by the end of the season. To get those kinds of seasons again, even from 2 spectacular Hall of Fame level players, in my opinion, 2 years in a row is pretty tough. I don't know if they're going to be able to do that again, but I think they might have to if they want to win 8-9 games.
I'm just going to try to be sunny today, a little bit different than I usually am. I put the money on an over. I put the money on an over at 7.5 because I think they can Tomlin themselves into a surprise win or 2, which gets them to 8.
And that's really the key thing, isn't it? I hate betting against Mike T, but this year, I don't know, man.
Like
I wasn't optimistic last year, and what I saw last year cannot be replicated ever. There's no way 5 of those games to win all 5 of them. There's no way that happens again. I think they might need that to happen to get to that point. I hate betting against Mike Tomlin though for the same reasons you just mentioned.
I don't want to give my pick for the first game, but we know about the bizarre nature of first games. And I think,
last
the
year.
Bengals, the Bengals going into that game, and I don't want to, give away everything that I'm thinking, but, they got 3 new offensive line starters that have not played 1 snap in the preseason.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
And, I think that is going to be significant. And I think they're going to see a lot of different coverages than last year. As a base principle, they're going to see a lot of cloud. They're going to see a lot of too high safety looks, and they're going to have to figure out a way to weaponize Chase. They did it somewhat last year, but they're going to have to move him around the formation to figure out ways to continue to get big plays out of him, because teams are not just going to let him run up the boundary, play cover 1, cover 3, and you throw it over their head and he just scores touchdowns. I mean, they're not. It's not going to be Tecmo Bowl.
They didn't last year.
I mean,
Chase was as dangerous underneath as he was deep. The guy is legitimately one of the 3 best receivers in the game, and he's going into his second year. They're not going to have to work real hard to find ways to get that guy the ball, and he's going to make plays because he's an absolute freak. There's not much a whole lot of people can do about that.
Here's the interesting thing before we get into your rapid fire takes, and really quickly in the open mic segment, is the reason why I have a sunnier disposition. I'm kind of excited about this season is because of the statement that Mike Tomlin said about Kenny Pickett. Sometimes you were just born with it. And I think his level of play in the preseason should keep Steeler fans with a rosy disposition this year. Because if he is what he showed in the preseason, then this looks much better next year if the offensive line can solidify itself, because they have some nice weapons at the skill position. I know there's a lot of ifs. And there's a saying, if was a fifth, then we'd all be drunk. But
if your grandmother had balls, she'd be your grandfather.
Or she'd be your uncle. If your aunt had balls, she'd be your uncle. Pause. But that's kind of where I am. Let me jump into your rapid fire takes. And this was based on a tweet that you put up a few weeks ago. I got to pull up the photo here.
Dive into that.
Yeah, I want to dive into that.
The best players and
you want to dive? Or you want to say that
and all that? Read them to me. I might not be able to recite them verbatim.
Okay, let's see here. Let me as I find this here. So this was a post that you put up a while ago.
Yeah, it was a while ago. Let's see how stuck with them I am. Maybe
okay, best offensive player. You listed Deontay Johnson. I'm going to agree with you. I think Deontay Johnson is their best offensive player.
I'm going to say Deontay Johnson going into this season, and I think George Pickens is going to be the guy everyone's going to be yelling about in the comments in this segment in 8 weeks. I will probably still argue for Deontay Johnson just because from a skill perspective, that's more of what I went by. But Pickens is going to be a beast over the first 8 weeks of the season. I think Lance left, or maybe I did, and I'm just talking to myself. If somebody wants to let me know what's going on, I would appreciate it.
Yeah,
There's Lance.
Sorry.
I don't know what happened, if that was you or me or what, but
that was me. I'm sorry.
I carried that for a little bit. Let's move on. What was the other one?
Best defensive player. You listed 2, but I'm going to force you to pick one. I'm going to say Cam Hayward. I'm going to disagree there. I'm going to say TJ Watt's the best defensive player.
I think Watt gets more credit for what he does, and he is very good. It's impossible not to say Watt. Lance, I don't think he's going to play a ton this season. I sense injury coming. You look back in history, big time edge rushers do not play all of their first 6 seasons. And Watt misses a game or 2 here and there, but they end up with some type of fairly significant injury. I think at the end of the season, I think it'll be Hayward. I think Watt will win if they both play 17 games.
Your next category was biggest rookie impact, and you listed King George Pickens.
King George, without question. And this is a great rookie class. There's a lot to love among all of them, but George is an absolute freak. Far better than where he was drafted.
Just to disagree with you, I'm going to say Leal. I'm going to say
another guy I love.
I'm going to say Leal shocks people and finishes the season with 5.5 sacks and a ton of pressures in limited snaps, in under 500 snaps.
Seems like we have a breakout conversation going here as far as Kenny Pickett goes. I want to weigh in on that. The list of great NFL players that at least 20 teams didn't draft and 32 teams didn't trade up for is enormously large. Okay. I just want to put that out there. It's nobody said he's Trevor Lawrence, but that doesn't mean he cannot step in and be an effective NFL quarterback. I don't think it's going to be this year. I don't think it needs to be this year. But just to suggest that he was the 20th overall player drafted and no one else drafted him, it's nonsense. And didn't we talk about this last week with George Kittle too? People are saying, oh, he drafted Josh Dobbs over George Kittle. Steelers drafted a lot of guys over George Kittle. Everybody in the NFL, including the 49ers, drafted a lot of guys over George Kittle. If you knew that George Kittle was going to be who he was, he would have been drafted a lot higher. But you have plenty of reason to not have thought that. That's Absolutely. The draft. This isn't perfect. Just because nobody traded up for him doesn't mean that he's not any good. There's a variety of reasons that may or may not have happened. I mean, we could go all day on that, but let's just wait on Pickett. Okay, let's just wait.
So your breakout
preseason. I like what he saw, what we saw of him. That's all we need to look at right now.
Your breakout was Freiermuth.
I like Freiermuth in this offense. I think what we're going to see a lot of with Trubisky under center in Matt Canada's offense is the run pass option, the RPO. That does not mean a quarterback option. It does not necessarily mean a play action or fake handoff. You have to watch what the offensive line does. Okay. They're going to stay kind of in place. They're not really going to move on an RPO, but a very consistent theme of that is a tight end hooking around a linebacker and cutting in or out, depending on where the coverage is. That is usually the quarterback's first read in an RPO situation. The quarterback in an RPO is reading what defenses are doing after the snap. As they're dropping back, they're looking at where they're going. And from that, they're deciding whether to hand the ball off or throw it to probably 1 or 2 different places. I would bet money the Steelers sign Mitch Trubisky because he's pretty good at RPOs. He's not good at much else, but he's good with RPOs. He can make that read. It's not a real complicated throw. It doesn't necessarily mean that your offense is going to march up and down the field, but 1, you can if you don't defend it very well. And 2, it gives your quarterback a lot of very easy throws, and usually it's to your inside guys. And I think with that, Freiermuth is probably a 70, 75 catch guy this year. He'll be the one that we talk about in terms of a big step up from year 1 to year 2.
I agree. I think he will be deserving of the Muth chants that you hear at Heinz Field, or excuse me, Acrisure. I think he will be.
I acknowledge neither Ackershort nor Muth. It's still Hines and Heath to me.
Hines and Heath. And there's a point that I want to jump into because we're going long. It's fine. The season's about to start. The bounce back player, I'm not even going to read because you have Devin Bush. And I think Devin Bush is not going to be the bounce back player. I think the bounce back player, if he can stay healthy, by process of elimination, will be Tyson Alualu if he could play 450 to 500 snaps, just because of his importance and the fact that he played like 7 snaps last year. Of course, I'm being facetious. Your unsung hero is Larry Ogunjobi. I can agree with that. I think the unsung hero when he comes back will be KZ. I think KZ will be the unsung hero in terms of the schematic options that he provides for this defense. I think he was trending to be that before he got hurt in the preseason. So I'm going to say KZ as the unsung hero, but I can see where you're going with Larry Ogunjobi being the unsung hero.
Same reason, just on the defensive line, not the secondary. To be honest, at a 10,000 foot level, we're talking about the same thing. It's going to be versatility and a guy that is going to take on multiple roles and might not have the statistical achievements of the all pro players that they're around, but they will contribute highly to those things.
Steelers Freak, before we conclude the show, has put up some good points about where the Bengals are and where the Steelers are. And I like to look at, we call it sexy tanking, and I call it trending as well. I think the Steelers are in year 2 of sexy tanking and trending. And when I look at the Steelers and where they are, I think it's very similar to the Patriots in some regard, where Cam Newton was their sexy tanking trending guy. Ben Roethlisberger was their Steelers in year 1, which was last year's sexy tanking trending guy at the quarterback position. They draft Mac Jones. Steelers draft Kenny Pickett, which accelerates, where they're at in this process. When you look at the Steelers and the Bengals are advanced in their program, obviously, because they went to the Super Bowl. But I still think the Bengals are an ascending team to a certain extent, if you can be ascending and go to the Super Bowl, because they got their quarterback, they got their skill position guys. I think the Steelers have their next guy at quarterback. They've got their freakish skill position guy in Pickens, and they're building that group. The Steelers, where the Steelers are and the Bengals are different, is that offensive line. I think the offensive line, if the Bengals stuff works out, they're probably a year or 2 ahead in this sexy tanking trending process because their offensive line is much better. I think where the Steelers are to advance and get out of this sexy tanking is how quickly does their offensive line ascend. So I still think the Steelers right now are in phase 2 of sexy tanking / trending. And I think it can accelerate, if Pickett becomes at least as good as Mac Jones and that offensive line improves. Where do you think they are in terms of this whole sexy tanking and trending aspect? Is this year 2 of it?
Okay, first off, there's a reason teams are paying quarterbacks as much money as they are. And a huge part of that is the greatest parallel between teams that consistently go to the playoffs and teams that don't is the presence of an outstanding quarterback. That's a fairly subjective measurement, but I think we all know it when we see it. You want to get that quarterback because they give you the best chance to qualify for the playoffs every year. When you get into the playoffs, anything can happen. The Cincinnati Bengals are proof of that. Okay. The Cincinnati Bengals were favored in one of their 4 games in the playoffs. They won 3 of them and came damn close to winning all 4 of them. The reasons that they won were not what everyone talked about all season long. How great it was with Joe Burrow, how Jamar Chase is changing everything, and Joe Mixon's in there. And it was their defense that was up and down all season. Their defense, whatever it is that they did or changed or how it all came together, they were lights out in 4 playoff games. In other words, you get the quarterback to get you there, There's a lot of other things that come into it come playoff time. To suggest, though, that the Steelers are not sexy tanking because they made the playoffs and got utterly destroyed for the second time against the second best team that they played
they got
all year.
crushed.
They lost. They were 0-4 against Kansas City and Cincinnati by something like a combined score of 89,000-16. Okay, they got murdered by the best teams that they played last year. I can't stress this enough. Whatever it is that Cleveland was doing in week 17 was so bad, people legitimately thought, they were legitimately asking if they were sabotaging Baker Mayfield to drive his contract value down or to encourage a trade to get rid of him. They were not trying in that game. That was bad. Baltimore, I don't know what Baltimore was doing in week 18. They were not the same team either. And the Steelers needed 2 possessions in overtime to win that game. Pittsburgh won 5 games last year that really easily could have gone against them. Any one of those 5. They are who we thought that they were going to be. Just because they qualify for the playoffs in a 7-seed field with 9 wins and a tie does not mean they expected it. It doesn't mean that that's the way we should have expected it to go. And it doesn't mean that they're continuing on that success. If anything, what it means is we're going to see them fall this year. They are absolutely rebuilding. And sexy tanking is not actually tanking. It's building. It's putting young guys in place. It's developing the rest of your roster. I think they've had 2 good drafts back to back. I like what they have in the future. It's just not going to be there today. That's all. And that's good or that's bad. I think we're talking about a very different team this time next year, and we're going to see that.
I think the Steelers, when you look at them last year, and they were the equivalent of the Pitt Panthers if there was a 12-team playoff last year in college football. I mean, it just, Pitt would have no opportunity to win a national championship last year. They would have played Georgia and got smashed, by Georgia. I mean, so, it's a case of, it's sexy tanking / trending. I think this was a solid show. We're going to go ahead and get out of here. And again, probably on Twitter, I will update when we're going to do the show on Wednesday, what time, but we are going to shift to Wednesday and do a post game as well. I want to thank everybody that stayed on for this long show, this extra long edition, hour and 17 minutes. Thank you, guys. Continue to tune in, tell a friend, and subscribe. And we are going to go ahead and conclude the program. Go Steelers.